Well, welcome everyone. My name is Roland Bleiker. I'm coordinating the Visual Politics Research Program at the University of Queensland. And I'm delighted to welcome you for the first event this semester, Semester 1, 2021. We are running a series of interviews with authors of recent books on visual politics. And we have with us today the author, William Callahan, Professor William Callahan, talking about his book, Sensible Politics, Visualizing International Relations. So welcome, Bill. We're pleased to have you.
Thank you, Roland. It's an honor to be here with the sort of godfather of visual IR.
Look, before we sort of have a chat about Bill's book, I just want to say a few words to introduce Bill. And it's a particular pleasure in part because I have known Bill and I had the pleasure to work with him for quite a few decades now. Bill is Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics. He has previously taught at the University of Manchester, at Durham University, and in universities in Thailand, including at Chulalongkorn University. Bill has his PhD from the University of Hawaii, where he worked with Mike Shapiro. And one of the things I find fascinating about Bill's work is that it's genuinely interdisciplinary in a really remarkable way. I mean, he's written very innovative work on international relations using visuals, using a range of other kind of methods that are innovative. But Bill is also a leading China expert. He has written several highly influential books, including a couple with Oxford University Press. And I have this one here, China, the Pest Optimist Nation. Now, I have another book that I found here on my shelf, and a book that was published 20 years ago, one of Bill's earliest work, Contingent States, Greater China and Transnational Relations. And in fact, when I took this book from my shelf, I looked at the back and I realized I endorsed this book 20 years ago. And I did so because Bill was really one of the very innovative early scholars in East Asian studies who not only drew on conventional historical or policy kind of sources, but did research in a very innovative way, drawing on popular culture on a whole range of sort of innovative methods. And this was very unusual in East Asian studies, and Bill's work stuck out to me many, many years ago for this innovation. So we're absolutely pleased to have Bill with us and to discuss his newest book. I have to say, it came out with Oxford University Press in 2020. And I wanted to start, Bill, by asking, what is it that really got you interested in questions of the visual? So why did you write this book, and where did this interest come from?
Thank you, Roland, for your generous introduction. Those are two questions. Why did I write this book? I was actually supposed to write a different book. I got funding from the Asia Research Institute at National University of Singapore to write a book comparing China and India, sort of how Chinese and Indian intellectuals thought about the future, the sort of post-Western, post-American future. And I quickly found that that would be a very hard book to write. It didn't make sense to generalize Chinese people think this and Indians think that. But what had happened is at the same time as I was sort of doing my textual research, I was filming video interviews and kind of filming people on the street in their everyday life in India and China and Singapore, where I was. And I just ended up with this sort of archive of 100 interviews of people talking about their first experiences going abroad, whether you're Chinese going abroad to other countries or non-Chinese going into China. And what happened is that project, which was sort of a hobby, a sideline, eventually sort of took over my life because it took a lot of time doing these interviews. And the interviews were just really fascinating about not just what people thought about going abroad, Chinese kind of going from a socialist country to a capitalist country, for example, but also the feelings that they showed and the anxiety, the happiness, the discovery that you can see on people's faces and the tone of voice and things like that. So what I sort of quickly started to do was shift from thinking about you know, my main topic, which, as you said, is to study China, to explain China to non-Chinese, to sort of a Western or a non-Chinese audience, to shift it to using China and other East Asian sources to explain visual IR. And that's what I try to do in the book, is kind of shift from being a, you know, a China expert to being someone who's interested, who use Chinese examples and ideas to explain visuality and sensible politics and things like that.
Look, there's a whole range of topics you brought up there that I would love to sort of maybe delve into in a bit more detail. And there's the issue of, you know, your work on China, the issue of your practice as a filmmaker, the topic of your book. But maybe we could start by having a bit of a talk. Early on in your book, you make a case that you find much of the research in visual politics has focused on visual images, that is on sort of on photographs and film, and there's a relative neglect of work that deals not just with two-dimensional, but also with three-dimensional visuals, with artifacts, with performances. So I'm wondering how if you can elaborate a little bit on why you find this distinction is important and how you find the neglect of three-dimensional visuals, so what implications that has, and why you made you find these links particularly crucial. So,
yeah, thanks, Roland. I found that most of the critical work on visual IR was focusing on photographs and on films, and I thought that this left out a really interesting area of what I call visual artifacts, of something that is not just two-dimensional, but is three-dimensional. And even though people have talked about memorials and museums and things, I wanted to push it a bit further to look at how we can use these visual spaces like a wall or a garden to understand international relations in a different way. So it's not just about turning a museum exhibit into a text and analyzing it with textual analysis, which I did and lots of people do, and it's very good. But I thought that it'd be interesting to kind of push this further and look at sort of how you have to walk through a museum to experience it, how you have to sort of be at a wall to experience it, and how you have to, for a garden, you have to like go through it on certain itineraries and appreciate different views. And what this did for me is help me to shift from looking for the meaning of a photograph or a museum exhibit or a wall to more of the affect theory, sort of what Emma Hutchison did in Effective Communities. I'm trying to do even more in my book, is kind of look at how politics is about, not just about meaning, but about how people are connected through emotional and affect. So this is what I found really helpful about going to these three-dimensional sensory spaces like walls and gardens, is it gives you like a different, it lets you see international relations in a different register. There's something else going on there that really wasn't captured in looking at the meaning of films and photographs.
and that's of course also something, if I'm correct, that you're trying to capture with the title of your book, you know, Sensible Politics, in the sense that you don't just talk about visuals, about two or three-dimensional visuals, but you talk about how these visuals implement, work through, are engaged with a range of sensory practices, with sound, with feeling, with sense, with touch, with. So what are the challenges and sort of the potentials you see in theorizing these links between the visual and the sensory, and how do you define actually in terms of the etymological kind of notion? How do you define sensible politics in that sense?
Yeah, sensible politics, the title tries to have two meanings at the same time. One is the sort of multi-sensory politics. And what I'm doing there is what you were just saying, is that a lot of visual IR is about saying, oh, we need to move from the verbal to the visual, which I do and I think is important. But I realize that that's not enough. If you're talking about sort of the thing that I do, making documentary films, there's always sound there, it's audio visual. So I decided not to limit myself to just the visual and try and push farther to see how things like a garden is actually, the best example of a multi-sensory space, because you see it, you hear the birds, or you hear the wind, you smell the flowers. You can, if it's your garden outside, you can eat things, you can taste it, you touch it, you feel it. And it seems to go for all of the senses. And it's what I was trying to do is see how these senses sort of work together to produce a different kind of meaning, a different kind of feeling, one that is not necessarily a narrative. It's sort of a non-narrative, non-linear feeling. You can see this, the example I give in my essay or my chapter on gardens is how Louis XIV, when he was designing Versailles, he didn't design it as a narrative. He designed it as just a set of views, and they're not linked to tell a story. They are put together to generate affect, to generate feelings, so that when people went and saw Louis XIV's garden, they felt the power of the French state. They were in awe of it. And the same thing goes on in Chinese and Japanese gardens, that they're often set up on an itinerary, but the itinerary isn't a story with a beginning, middle, and end. It's an itinerary that just gives you a set of different views that are meant to provoke you, to sort of, make you have a shiver go down your spine. And that's what I guess I'm really interested in, is sort of the non-verbal nature of some of these politics, of making you feel things, whether you cringe because it's like, oh, I can't believe he said that, or it's a shimmer that's like, wow, this is just something I is so meaningful, but it's very hard to describe and understand.
That's of course also something that sort of enters very much into an epistemological debate, in the sense that it's about, we don't just objectively analyze the world, but we as scholars are embedded in this form of analysis, including our feelings are embedded in the analysis. And I know from knowing your work and knowing some other works that you're not just a sort of a theorist, but you're also a practitioner. Like you do your own gardening, but also you're a filmmaker, and you teach a class at the LSE that basically teaches filmmaking as a practice of IR. And of course, there's a range of people who do that now innovatively. Sophie Harman, Cindy Weber, and so on. You're part of this group of innovative scholars who's using film. So can you sort of give me a sense of how your own aesthetic practices in filmmaking and gardening and other things, how they have informed your scholarship, and how you kind of then deal with the object-subject divide, and how you kind of, is there a scholarly bill and a practitioner bill, or are the two of them linked, or how do they interact with each other? So.
Originally, there was a scholarly bill and a filmmaker bill, or scholarly William and a filmmaker bill. And I would make my films in July, just for fun, during the summer. During my summer break, I would make a film every July. And what happened is that the films started sort of leaking into my academic work. And at the same time, my academic work was leaking more and more into my films. And what I find is interesting is that, both are important. At first I thought, Jesus, I'm not gonna write another book. This will be my last book. I'm just gonna make films. But now I'm trying to think of a sort of a methodological way of approaching international relations that it kind of combines writing and filmmaking. So the chapter on methods that came out of a Millennium Conference comes from this film I made about toilets in China. And what I was doing in that short film is looking at international politics in a very kind of localized sense of how people feel when they're abroad, when they're vulnerable. When are you more vulnerable? When you have to, take a shit in a foreign country and you don't know how it works. So I explored that in terms of vulnerability, in terms of self-other relations, in terms of body politics, very big, important issues in critical international relations. And then I thought, oh, this would actually make a nice article. And then I kind of wrote the article, and then I made the film, I re-edited the film. So the article and the film kind of speak to each other. And I've kept doing that. So right now, I just finished writing an article about the visual politics of noses in China. So that one of the ways that Chinese people have distinguished between self and other, between Chinese and foreigners, is by your nose. Do you have a big nose? You have a flat nose? What kind of nose do you have? And there's a lot of literary evidence for this. And I looked at propaganda posters from the PRC and so on. But then I thought, Jesus, this would make a great film. And this would make a good quirky film that people would be interested in, rather than making a film about, the new Cold War of US-China relations. It'd be much more interesting, I think, to make a film about how the US and China and other countries interact through noses, and the nose knows in a way. So this is what I'm trying to do, is have this sort of analytical essay writing and the creative filmmaking speak to each other, and not have one be central and the other be an illustration. Because right now what happens is that to get money to make a film, I have to say, oh, I wrote an article and now I'm going to make a film to illustrate that as an impact statement, an impact study. That kind of thinking of films as just sort of to explain what you did in your book doesn't really make sense anymore. So that's what I'm trying to do, is have the book and the film speak to each other.
And that, of course, also enters the whole issue of what is creativity. How can we do creative work in international relations as scholars or as practitioners? How do we express things in ways that are not verbal? What non-verbal forms of communication do we have? Are they different from verbal ones? Are they more, is creativity in the links between them? So how do you see in your practice, or maybe even conceptually, how do you see creativity working out in terms of finding new ways of understanding the world, new ways of thinking about the world, or even feeling about the world? Where is creativity in that sense? Where do you get the creativity for your work? Where do you get the ideas that you pursue, and how do you pursue them then?
One of the things I'm doing in the book is trying to kind of shift from seeing things in terms of sort of self-other relations and inside-outside defining international politics, to shift to seeing, which what we do. So self-other relations, inside-outside, our job as scholars is to deconstruct this, to show how it's socially produced, how it's not the truth, how it hides hidden ideologies and hidden meanings. But what I'm trying to do now is kind of shift to being more, or seeing international politics in a creative way. I'm creative of new social orders, new world orders that aren't necessarily good. This isn't to solve the problem of Western IR with some sort of exotic Eastern IR. It's to just rethink about politics or rethink about critique from deconstruction to creativity. And we see this in a lot of our colleagues' work, not just the filmmakers that you mentioned, but also people who are making collages, who are making memes, who are doing sort of artistic things to express not just a critique of the current world order, but also think about a different way of organizing the world that's not just about sort of ideology, but is about, how do you want to feel? What sort of world do you want to live in? What sort of feeling do you want, as well as what you don't want?
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned in that sort of creative sort of way of engaging the world, the critiquing the world, also the issue of China and so on. And of course, that's one of your key things, is you have a China hat, you have an international relations hat. Sometimes they're very different, sometimes they merge. And in fact, I didn't mention at the beginning, you're joining us here from Taiwan, not from London, from the LSE, but you're in Taiwan at the moment. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about one of the key movements, of course, in international relations, or in any field at the moment, is the whole question of decolonizing knowledge, decolonizing politics, from the Black Lives Matter movement to discussions in international relations around questions of security and so on. And you have, of course, worked for many, many decades in the non-Western world. Your China hat is always something that was part of you. And your book offers extensive case studies on China. You also have case studies on the Middle East. How do you see that link between the question of colonization, decolonization, but also the visual? How does the visual fit in? We need to decolonize the visual as well, of course. The visual is very much part of a Western tradition. So do East Asian traditions offer an alternative? Do they offer an insight? Where do you see these links between decolonization and the work you do? So it's a tricky, difficult question, of course. It's an ongoing process. We all have to kind of engage, but I was wondering.
Sure. It would be kind of easy and popular to say that China provides an alternative way of understanding things to Western modernity and just talk about that. I actually did that for a while in the late 90s and early 2000s, China as an alternative. I'm less convinced of that now because what I've seen in the scholarship, but also in policy in China, is that the alternative world order that they're presenting is just reviving the Chinese empire. I mean, it's amazing how the concepts that my Chinese colleagues have chosen to revive are the ones that ruled a hierarchical empire that was very violent. So what I'm trying to do is criticize Eurocentrism in IR without falling into some alternative Sinocentrism, China-centrism. What I do is I take, as you said, my experience of working on studying China for 40 years. I lived in Thailand for almost 5 years, lived in Chinese places for 3 or 4 years, I guess another year because I'm in Taiwan for a year, hooray. What I found is that a lot of people who are doing or criticizing Eurocentrism in IR are sort of criticizing things like Hollywood or the global hegemony of Western media and things like that. And what is happening there is that often they're just sort of still generalizing from Western experience. And one of my colleagues here in Taiwan talked about how we also have to think about the West as method, where you generalize from Western experience or use Western concepts to measure the non-West. So the non-West is just a case study. It's not a source of ideas and concepts and experiences. And Wendy Brown is the exemplary case of this in her book about walls, which is a great book, but it's just amazing how she just says, I don't care. I don't care about anything beyond the West. And if somebody else wants to study it, good luck to you. This shows just a general trend in sort of critical scholarship is to just focus on criticizing the West and think that you're done. So what I'm trying to do is switch things around a little bit and not start in the West, even if you're criticizing Trump's wall. I think it's to criticize Trump's wall, for example, it's actually best to start with the Great Wall of China. The Great Wall of China gives you a lot of history, a lot of concepts, a lot of experiences that helps you understand the Berlin Wall and the US-Mexico barrier and the West Bank barrier with Israel and Palestine. And what I do in my chapter on walls is I try to sort of operationalize how the wall worked at various times in Chinese history, and how rather than seeing the wall as a barrier that separates an organic community, with like the Berlin Wall, for example, the Great Wall of China was about gaps. It was about gateways. It was about flows. And I think that experience and that history and those concepts of walls as gaps rather than walls as barriers helps me go back and think about the US-Mexico barrier in different ways. So it's not about, oh, the wall's okay now, because it's about gateways rather than barriers. It's about shifting the way we analyze walls from kind of tracing inside outside as a social experience to looking at who is governing the flows. How do those flows work? Who gets in and who gets out? How do they get in and out? So to me, that shifts the way we understand walls and it shifts the way we critique walls. And it uses these sort of medium, not high theory, but what some of us call medium theory of concepts like gaps and barriers, inside, outside, and so on. I do the same thing in my chapter on gardens to think about the 9/11 memorial in New York City, not as the kind of the central thing, but as an example, as a case study that some Chinese and Japanese concepts can help us understand. So rather than talking about kind of the militarization of society, which often happens in Western IR, I look at this concept of civil military or civility martiality, where you're neither, it's not the civilians versus the military, it's not the civilians versus the soldiers, it's every person within themselves is both civil, meaning cultured, and martial, meaning sort of militaristic, and that the ideal person in historical China had to do the balance between their civility and martiality within themselves, within their family, within their society, within their kingdom, within the whole world. So that's what I do in that chapter, is kind of look at how civil military relations are involved in making a garden and making how we understand the 9/11 memorial in New York works as well.
Look, your kind of elaborations have opened up issues and questions on a range of issues, obviously, around borders, transnational flows, questions of identity, how the visual links to it. Look, I think it might be best if we kind of open up the discussion now and bringing people in who are either online or here in Brisbane, and sort of complete the sort of the formal or semi-formal part of the interview. And I want to just basically finish by thanking Bill again for joining us. If you haven't read it, do read his book, Sensible Politics, Visualizing International Relations. And thanks so much for joining us, Bill, and we'll go now to a more informal discussion.
Thanks, Roland.
Thanks, Bill.